once, assuming that they all amount to the same thing. The real problem is that some of these things just may not be possible. They may be possible over the long term for Afghans themselves to build a stable state, but it's probably a project of decades. It needs indigenous leadership, a sort of Afghan Thomas Jefferson, to rebuild a state. It's not something that foreigners can come in and do from outside. The United States, its allies, are quite good at certain kinds of things, building roads, providing some training to the military, helping to build hospitals and schools, but building a state is a project for a founding father. The same with fighting the Taliban. Again, they have quite a lot of support from villages in the south of Afghanistan. And the Kabul government, as we saw in the last election, just doesn't have much credibility or support. It's perceived as having won in a corrupt fashion. And it's going to be very difficult for the United States to try to put itself between the Kabul government and the Taliban.
So you're saying that the goals are simply wrong?
I'm saying that the goals are absolutely mistaken in terms of U.S. national security and probably in the end in terms of the interests of the Afghan people.
They're wrong because we can't accomplish them or because it's not what we should be trying to do?
So we can't accomplish them, and in trying to do so, we're often making the situation worse. Afghanistan is very poor, very fragile, very traumatized. To rebuild a country like that would take 30 or 40 years of patient, tolerant investment. And probably that's what we should be aiming for. But in order to do that, we need to have a presence there which is affordable, which is quite small, which is realistic, and which the American people will endorse. People aren't going to put up with over 100,000 troops on the ground and this level of casualties forever. So probably better for us, better for the Afghans, would be to step back and say, hey, we're not going to try to do all this stuff. We've got two very limited objectives. We'd like to make sure that al-Qaeda doesn't significantly increase its ability to harm the United States, and we'd like to do something for the Afghan people. And we recognize that doing those two things is a very long-term process, and so we probably need fewer troops, not more.
How many troops do you believe are needed in Afghanistan right now?
Not that many. I would have thought what you needed from the point of view of al-Qaeda, counterterrorism, is probably 10 to 20,000 special forces and intelligence operatives, doing pretty much what they've been doing quite successfully over the last 7-8 years. People are saying we failed in the counter-terrorist objectives. Of course, we haven't really. Osama bin Laden isn't in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda hasn't got bases in Afghanistan. And I think we could continue to ensure that was the case.
With 10 or 20,000 troops on the ground, can the United States, can the Allies, A, keep the Taliban out, and B, keep Al-Qaeda out?
We need to distinguish between Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The answer is, of course, if we reduce the troop numbers, the Taliban presence, particularly in the areas where they have a lot of support, would grow. And that is a risk, and that's a problem. And it's a very sad thing, because the Taliban are a horrendous group. I mean, this is the problem that we're dealing with here. They have been vicious, their treatment of women is appalling. Many Afghans are horrified by them and don't want them out. And anything that we can do to try to support more positive elements in Afghan society, we should do. But we cannot try to write a blank check. If we go for a sort of all-or-nothing approach, I think we're going to end up abandoning the country in 5 years' time, being less kind than we will be otherwise. So, distinguish Taliban from Al-Qaeda. Taliban, broadly speaking, are Afghans, farmers, subsistence farmers. As I say, most of those people can't find the United States on the map. Al-Qaeda traditionally are much more educated middle-class people, often from Egypt, from Saudi Arabia, North Africa, people who have master's degrees, who've lived in Hamburg, who learn to fly aeroplanes. We can't confuse those two. There's no point us getting into a fight with 6 million Afghans when our real target is probably a few hundred terrorists who have the capacity to harm the United States. Our real issue is not who wants to harm the United States. Our real issue is who can, and how do we prevent those people who actually have the ability to do that.
And with 10 or 20,000 troops, do you believe that the Allies can get rid of Al-Qaeda?
I'm not a military expert, but I would like to ask the military that question. I'd like to go to them and say, listen, you're not going to be able to have 600,000 troops. You're not going to be able to stay for 40 years. So let's just turn this around. Let's say you've only got 10,000, you've only got 20,000. But we can maintain it for 20 or 30 years. What would you be able to do? And my guess is they'd come back and say, okay, with that, we can probably make sure that Osama bin Laden never again sets up a major training camp in Afghanistan.
Let me read to you something that former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was quoted as saying the other day, if you want another terrorist attack in the U.S., abandon Afghanistan.
I would say that Secretary Rice is exaggerating the situation. Pakistan is much more of a threat than Afghanistan to US national security. Al-Qaeda is in Pakistan, not in Afghanistan. Pakistan, of course, has a nuclear weapon. Pakistan's a much larger country. It could destabilize India. Afghanistan is, of course, a poor, fragile state, like Somalia, like Yemen, like many other countries in the world. Of course, we should be doing things to try to stabilize it. But that is, and I want to disagree respectfully with her, not the place where the next attack is most likely to come from.
Let's talk about the politics of this a little bit. You've met with Secretary Clinton.
Sure.
You've met with Special Envoy Richard Holbrooke.
Sure.
What do you tell them?
Again, my message is focus on what we can do. We don't have a moral obligation to do what we can't. People can get very fixed by saying, but surely you're not saying we ought to do nothing. Surely you're not saying we ought to allow the Taliban to do this or that. And I just keep saying ought implies can. You don't have a moral obligation to do what you can't do.
How is your advice taken?
I think what I see at the moment is that people are polite because they imagine maybe I have some experience of Afghanistan, but I'm one of a broad community of people. We have 9 people working in my center at Harvard who've worked there for 20 or 30 years. And the problem we all have is that if the administration has, for some reason, already decided that they're going to increase troops, they're going to do a counterinsurgency campaign, it's very difficult for them to take on board people coming back and saying, look, actually, I don't think this is going to work. It's a great idea. I can see why you want to do it. But by trying to do the impossible, you may end up doing nothing. I'd like to present an alternative strategy, which is lighter, more intelligent, and may end up actually achieving something.
And again, their reaction, they listen politely, you say?
They listen politely, but in the end, of course, basically the policy decision is made. What they would like is little advice on some small bit. I mean, the analogy that one of my colleagues used recently is this. It's as though they come to you and they say, we're planning to drive our car off a cliff. Do we wear a seatbelt or not? And we say, don't drive your car off a cliff. And they say, no, 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 that decision's already made. The question is, should we wear a seatbelt? And you say, well, I suppose by all means wear a seatbelt. And they say, okay, we consulted with policy expert Rory Stewart, etc.
Does the West, do the NATO allies, do they simply not understand Afghanistan?
I think they understand the country, but they have a much more basic problem, which is that they believe failure is not an option. There's no alternative. And once you get into that mindset, everything follows from that.
You also suggest that if you add more troops, that will create a backlash that will somehow ultimately cause us to abandon Afghanistan. How does that syllogism work?
That basically works because American voters, American taxpayers, are not going to put up with this. You can already see public support going against this. You can see Congress and the Senate increasingly skeptical. I think it's very irresponsible, if you care about Afghanistan, to increase troops much more. Because I can see us going from engagement to isolation, from troop increases to total withdrawal. The path the President has started us on, I would predict, would mean that in 5-6 years' time, everybody will simply get fed up with Afghanistan and abandon it entirely.
And in fact, we're seeing that in the polls right now, that the latest ABC News Washington Post poll, 51% of adults say the war is not worth fighting.
Right, and this is the very worst thing for a country like Afghanistan. This was the Charlie Wilson war effect. We go in there, we give it $1 billion this year, we give it 0 the next year. It's sort of boom to bust. What we actually should have done is capped our troop levels at quite a modest number, 20,000, 30,000, which is what we had in 2004, 2005, and tried to stay with the long, difficult game of protecting the United States and helping Afghans.
Do you think that our leaders are just too far removed from the people to understand?